Good morning, good day, good afternoon to each of you who are joining us for this webinar on the intersection of faith and gun violence prevention, hosted by the Office of Public Witness here in Washington, D.C. of the Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. We thank you for joining us for the webinar on this day and for your commitment to gun violence prevention and ending gun violence in your communities across the United States or perhaps around the globe. We are going to start our time this morning with a pause to remember those who were lost to gun violence during the season of Easter in 2023. As people of faith, we lament every life that has been and is lost to gun violence in this nation and around the globe. And we recognize that our time of reflection this morning represents a small snapshot of what our nation has experienced this year. As of this morning in 2023, 24,610 lives have been lost to some form of gun violence. I give thanks this day for Aria Sadler, who is a summer fellow with the Office of Public Witness here in Washington, D.C., and has worked tirelessly to put together this webinar and our conversation this afternoon. Thank you, Aria, for being here.
Thank you so much, Christina. Before we begin, I want to start out with some housekeeping things. You can use the chat function in order to share who you are and where you're from, where you're zooming in from. And let me make sure that is turned on. Let's see. Christina, could you do that?
I'll work on it, yes.
Thank you so much. And with that being said, also please reserve questions for the Q&A feature. At the end, we'll have time where Jimmy can go through, moderate some questions and ask those to our panelists. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, we have Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, who is the Director of the Office of Public Witness, as well as the Presbyterian Ministry at the United Nations. Thank you so much for being here, Jimmy. He'll be moderating our conversation. We also have Tracy Campbell, who is the Senior Health Manager for the Office of Violence Prevention in Mecklenburg County. And we have Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, who is the Associate Professor of Bible and Director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And finally, we have Reverend Deanna Hollis, who is the Gun Violence Prevention Ministry Coordinator with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. Thank you all so much for being here and for having this conversation with us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jimmy.
Thank you, Aria. I am just so excited about this wonderful opportunity to engage in a conversation with our three panelists, and with their permission, I will call each one of you by your first name. It's just a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation, and I really want to take advantage of it by hearing from your wisdom. So we've got a couple of questions for you, but first, we would ask if each one of you would just give us a brief introduction of how did you get into this gun violence work? And just share personally about your commitment to it. And I will go by the order that you hear. Sister Tracy, if you would go first, and then Deanna, and then Brother Sadler, if you would give your comments after Deanna.
Absolutely. I am so honored to be here today to share with you a little bit about the work that's happening in Mecklenburg County and the work that is happening across the country with some of our colleagues that are continuing to do this work. So how I got into this work, before coming to Mecklenburg County and starting the Office of Violence Prevention here in Charlotte, North Carolina, I was working at a level 1 trauma center here in the city and doing injury and violence prevention work there. One of the things that I kept witnessing was a lot of young men, particularly young men of color, coming in with violent related injuries. And I really felt like there wasn't a system in place and we weren't doing much other than patching them up and sending them back out and hoping and praying that they wouldn't come back. And they came back. And so our recidivism rate was really high with that revolving door. And I just felt like we needed to be doing more. So I really became very vested in working with some of those young people that were coming in the door and trying to provide them with as much resources and services as we could to wrap around them to prevent them from coming back in with same kind of related injuries. So that was really where my love and passion for this work came, alongside of I've had several family members who have been victims of homicide in North Carolina, right here in Charlotte. And so it's very personal to me as well. So I'm committed to the work, excited to be doing the work, though it can be daunting at times and a little frustrating, but certainly committed that we've got a lot of committed folks in this area that are banding together to do the work.
Great. Yeah, I am also excited to be here, to be able to be a part of this. I am a native Texan. I grew up to a family of hunters, and so I really didn't think much about gun violence or gun laws until 2016, when Texas passed a law that allowed guns on college campuses. And our oldest daughter was a student at Texas Tech at the time. And so I witnessed how her friends and her roommates were responding to that law, and they were doing it exactly as the law intended, and that they saw it as an invitation to buy guns. And so, not knowing how I was going to keep my child safe if everybody around her was suddenly going to have a gun, and not knowing, what type of training were they having, what type of experience did they have, this just sounded like a recipe for disaster. So a friend of mine had just joined Moms Demand Action, and so she invited me to join. So that's what I did. I joined Moms Demand Action. And in that role, I'd already been to seminary, and in that role, I'd served as a faith leader. And so then the NRA came to Dallas for their national convention, and part of an interfaith group called Faith Forward Dallas, we held a prayer vigil on the steps of the city hall that ran from the beginning of the convention to the end. And at the end of that, I just really felt called. I will say there were lots of faiths represented, and I was really the only Presbyterian that was there that day. So no bad on Presbyterians, but I was like, man, we had policy, because everybody there was telling me about our policy and how they were modeling our policy after them. But I was like, maybe there's a role that needs to be filled here, is that this policy wasn't getting, to the people. And so anyway, so that's when I found the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and I became ordained to this role in 2019.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rodney Sadler. I think that I came to this through a number of different ways. The first, I remember being awakened in the middle of the night, maybe a little over 22 years ago, when I heard from my sister that my baby brother had been shot at 19 years old, driving down the street in Camden, New Jersey. And he, praise God, lived through that, was able to live for the rest of his life with a bullet in his arm. But it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years later that his best friend was assassinated in our same neighborhood in Camden, New Jersey, with an AK-47. Because he came back to his house after he was told by someone that he shouldn't be there. Later on, I had to do his memorial service for him. And then a few years later, I had to do the memorial service for my cousin, one of my oldest cousins, is a couple years younger than I am, who took his life by suicide. And I realized that this is not just an issue of gun violence by homicide, but gun violence by suicide, accidents, and so many other things that are significant for us. And then I think, as a biblical scholar, someone who wrestles with scripture and wrestles with what Walter Brueggemann talks about, God's alternative vision of what the world should be, I realize that the world as it is completely antithetical to what the world should be like. So I think it's the intersection of my life experiences and my role, my vocational role to bring forth Koa and I, thus says the Lord, that has brought me into this space.
Excellent. I really appreciate each one of you sharing personally. We have 132 participants in this call, and I know they came because of the excellency of this, you and your expertise. And as we talk, people are very familiar with what's going on in their families and communities. So we want to talk a lot about solutions, especially what you are doing, what is working. So I'm going to, and two of you work for the church, Rodney and Deanna, and Tracy, you work for the city of Charlotte, in really a unique role. How can the church address the root causes of gun violence? And what are some of the things that you are doing that you really would like to share with others that you think might be able to be applied in other communities? And we're going to keep going in this order, but Deanna, if you would go first, and then Rodney, and then Tracy.
Yeah, so I appreciate, naming the root cause. And I think that's one of the first things that we need to do. And that is one of the first things that I do when I go and talk to people, is I name that the reason why we have a gun violence problem in this country is because of the gun industry and their need to have to sell their non-consumable product in the saturated market. And our lawmakers have been in support of the gun industry all the way back to the Civil War, when the factory model was developed. And so we have to keep these factory doors open and some of them closed, because when there was no war, there was no demand for the guns. And so the gun manufacturers went to the lawmakers and said, if you want guns to fight your wars, then you need to give us a business. And so that's how we've got into this problem. And so I believe there's several things you can do. And we have a congregational toolkit that outlines all the very different things that congregations can do. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. But if you see my shirt, Guns to Gardens, this has been one of the things that we've really been working on. It we feel like this is a role for the church, is that because we have all these guns, there's not really any way to dispose of them unless you return them to the marketplace. But we found is a lot of people don't want to do that. They don't want their gun or their father's gun or their grandfather's gun or the gun that was used by one of their loved ones to end their life. They don't want those guns going back to the marketplace. And so we believe churches can become safe surrender sites. And so we've been holding Guns to Gardens action circles in which we give congregations best practices for how they can go about being a safe surrender site, so we can begin to embody Isaiah's words of turning our swords into plowshares. And so some of the things we do is we make like this right here. This is a necklace. We partner with the organization Raw Tools, and this is made from a gun barrel. It's a heart necklace. They make tools and shovels. And so our next round of action circles are going to be starting September 7th. And so we just invite you. You can find the link to sign up. We'll be probably live next week on our website, the September 7th through October 5th. So we'd love to help you, know how to get these unwanted guns that can be dangerous, not safely stored, out of homes and turned into something that can be life-giving.
Amen. I love everything that Deanna just said. Thank you so much for the good work that you're doing there. If I were to think about what the issue is, I think that there are multiple intersecting issues. Of course, the gun lobby and the work that it's doing, the gun industry is definitely one of the major foci with the problem. Another thing that I hope we can talk about a little bit later on is the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, which is a horribly written, utterly confusing, grammatically problematic statement that needs careful exegesis. It lingers in our society and it controls our collective psyche in a way that makes us believe that guns are sacred, makes us believe that they are a sacred component to our society, something that God has given us, and that's completely antithetical to everything that I believe to be true by and large. Another major concern is the fact that I believe that we've lost connection with the value of human life. I think that we, and this is something that we as the church bear a particular responsibility for. We are told in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, that every human being is made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. We bear God's likeness, that there's something special about us. Genesis 9, verse 6 lifts up the point that because we're made in the image of God, human beings should not take other human beings' lives. But I think that we've lost that core value. We've lost the centrality of this that grounds our faith as Jews, as Christians, as Muslims, as Baha'is, as Quakers, as Jews, as any people of faith. And inasmuch as we've lost the sacredness of human life, I think it makes it easy to undermine the value of human life in the public square. So I think that we need to work on all of those, and the church in particular needs to work on how do we recenter the value of human life. I've been trying to do that, of course, with a lot of the work that I do around issues of poverty, race, and violence. And I think that if we can begin to center that, we can begin to make some significant progress. And one last issue I'm just going to point out briefly is we've got a problem with Congress. We have a Congress that really does not have a backbone and is unwilling to stand up to the gun lobby and to stand up to these other groups and say, we need to do something about gun violence, that it is partially within our power. We have the agency to do something about it.
So I certainly agree with everything that's been said, and I want to just add a different context to what some of those root causes are, and really think about structural and systemic issues that have plagued communities for decades, and historical problems and inequities, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about housing, poverty. All of those things are things that lend people to have less hope, to feel like they don't have opportunities, to have less faith, to be fearful. All of those things are driving gun violence. a combination of those things. Imagine if you're hungry and you're not sure where you're going to lay your head, and whether or not your children are going to have an education that is equal to other people on another side of town. And then add that there's fear and there's hopelessness. People tend to think that more guns are the issue. That's the solution. That if I just have a gun, if everyone else has a gun, I need a gun as well. And that is driven a lot by fear. And so I think, the church and houses of faith have a lot to do in this role. A lot of things that they can do is that this is not just an issue, a social issue, it's a heart issue. We have lost a lot of family values and people knowing their neighbor, wanting to be neighborly. There are many people that have no idea who their neighbors are. You see them come and go, but if you ask them and their life depended on it for you to say, what are their names of the 4 people that live around you, it would be the end for them. And so thinking about not knowing your neighbor and building this sense of community back helps to reduce fear and creates opportunities for folks to better themselves. Some of the things that we're doing in Mecklenburg County and hope to continue to do is working with our faith communities, trying to bring them together, to drive them in the same direction, to have some common goals and work across denominations, to work across towns, to have sister churches where you can do work together, getting them to partner with our community-based organizations that are out here that are really struggling for resources. Sometimes they just need space, and houses of faith have space. They have opportunities for young people to get involved. We have a lot of problems with young people not having much to do. I think that the church has a lot to do with that, can do a lot of work in this space, thinking about how we get outside of the 4 walls of the church and do the work of faith communities, which is not just taking care of your parishioners, but taking care of your neighbors and seeing people outside of your house of faith as being your neighbors. So those are some of the things that I think are some of the issues driving and some of the things that houses of faith can do to work on those.
Excellent. And Tracy, if I could follow up with you, I know that you and Rodney are in Charlotte. Are there any programs outside of your immediate work or inside of your immediate work that you're excited about that you think could be models? And Deanna, if you would answer that for national scope, and all of you have talked about, you talked about guns, gardens, but I do think one of the things we want to do is share what's going on in our community so that people can hear. They might not be able to duplicate it, but some would say, that's an interesting idea. Any other concrete ideas that are going on in Charlotte that you would really think are good models?
I'm thinking of not necessarily concrete things, but I'll say that there is a lot of partnering going on. And so I'm excited about that. And I think there are, again, a lot of opportunities for space and working with people that are already doing the work. Some of the times when I'm working with faith communities, depending on where they are, they're fearful about going to certain sides of town, doing work there. And so partnering with people who are already doing that work and doing the resources and things that you can do. One of the things we always try to encourage people to do is think outside of the box. What is violence prevention? And reading to a child is violence prevention. And that is something that most every adult has the opportunity to do. So partnering with our school systems is huge. And we certainly encourage a lot of folks to do that. There are a lot of school systems that could use bodies and adults that would are retired or have time that they can come and spend and read to young people. One of the things that we know in Charlotte from a Chetty study was that Charlotte ranked 50 out of 50 for economic upward mobility. And so what they said was that a child born into poverty in Charlotte, North Carolina, was more than likely to die in poverty. And that a lot of people don't read above a 3rd grade reading level. And that is something that certainly houses of faith and people that are tied to churches can do. So we really try to focus on what are those small tangible things, whether it is a community garden, whether that is reading to children, whether that is having a food pantry or a clothing closet, and not making sure you don't have a junk closet at your house of faith, that you're actually getting those things and those resources to people that need them most.
Yeah, so we look at there's kind of 3 areas that we say we can do to change to end gun violence. And the first is we're going to need to have legislation The next is we're going to have to change culture, and then we're going to have to interrupt this gun business. And so to change legislation, I mean, that's going to require advocacy, but in some places, really what we're learning is advocacy isn't as impactful as it's just going to be fat to get out the vote. And so there's a website called Gun Sense Voter. And so you can go there and you can find what candidates is it that are going to support gun safety laws. And that's who you need to be voting for, is the ones that are saying that we are going to put laws in place. But even with laws, we need to be able to change culture. So for example, we know that access is a really big thing, in that children, over 4 million children at least, live in homes with unsecured and loaded guns. And so we want to be able to normalize the ask, are there guns in the home? And if so, how are they stored? So we really want to encourage safe storage. And that's not just something that can happen by laws, but it's going to require cultural change, right? To where we normalize that this is what happens. And if there's a gun in that home, you don't send your kid there, right? Because we can't expect children to be responsible for their own safety. We really need to put that onus back on the gun owners and on the adults, because if you're going to own a gun, let's go back to responsible gun ownership and make sure that nobody else has access to that. The other thing that how we can interrupt this gun business is that here in Texas, one of the things that happened, this is where Uvalde happened. And so one of the things we know is that shooter, on the day he turned 18, he went out and bought that assault style rifle. And it was probably the first time he ever shot a gun. But the gun laws worked. He wasn't able to purchase that gun until the day he turned 18. And he had tried on 2 other times to do it. But that age worked. So we want to see that we raise the age to 21 for all guns. But part of the way that the gun industry normalizes culture is to get these guns in the sight of children, because we know that the younger you're exposed to a gun, the more likely you are to become a gun owner. So we encourage, this is something anybody can do, is when you go shopping, if you're in any place that has a gun display, take a photo of it and call out that store on social media and say, hey, stop exposing my kids to their killer, because guns are the #1 killer of children and youth. And so we need to call out the businesses that have guns to where anyone under the age of 21 can see it, so that not only are we passing the laws to get it, but we're going to start changing the culture that says we don't even want to see them when we go to buy soccer balls and when we go to buy shirts or sporting goods. Get these guns out of the sights of children. And this is one way we can begin to interrupt that gun business.
Brother Sadler, did you want to add anything about Charlotte? You're on mute.
Thank you for that. I would love to add something, not necessarily just about Charlotte, though I think some of the most interesting things that are being done in Charlotte to help interrupt this are relationship building groups that are coming together in communities to help people develop relationships, to bring people back together again, because there is a fundamental disconnection between human beings in this country that we've got to begin to figure out a way behind. When I'm thinking about this in terms of a national issue, I remember the beginning of the movie Bowling for Columbine. Michael Moore points out the fact that we have so many guns in America in part, and even though we have guns that are perhaps a rate of gun ownership that's similar to Canada, that we tend to utilize guns against other human beings in a much greater way because we haven't dealt with the issue of race in America. And we believe of the racial other as a danger that we need to protect ourselves from. I think in part, we're not going to turn this around until we begin to address the issue of race in America. I think we also have to begin to address the issue of poverty in America. Coretta Scott King talked about poverty as one of the greatest senses of violence that we have in our community. If we're violent enough to allow 40% of our people to live within poverty in our nation, that kind of violence gets into communities. And Tracy's already talked about the fact that people that live in imperiled communities often act in ways that manifest themselves much more violently. But again, so I think that there's a fundamental soul problem. I love the fact that Dr. Barber talks about we need a spiritual revival in this nation, a moral defibrillator. There's something that we need to do that is the work of the church to address this significant lack of concern for human valuation.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for your sharing, because I think, again, the sharing of ideas is just so important as we in different regions of the country try to figure out how can we be more effective. But there's a lot of work that's going on already. And I would encourage all of our those who are watching to read the chat, because a lot of good conversations are going on in the chat, and people are sharing organizations and ideas. And one of the ideas that I would share is that when I was pastoring in Durham, we had an organization called Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham. And one of the major issues, one of the major strategies was that whenever there was a shooting in Durham, we would contact the family, ask them with their permission, could we hold a prayer vigil on the spot where they lost their loved one, and would ask them to come and to talk about their loved one. Because one of the things that gets forgotten is that the victims who lose their lives, we kind of keep account on that, but the family members that are impacted, I mean, so just 5/10 of people who are impacted. And so one of the things we also want to do is to help this country to heal, because as Tracy said, there's so many families that have been impacted. So based on this conversation, I'm throwing some curveballs to the panelists. I just want those who are watching to know, because these are not all of the questions that we shared. But all of you have talked about faith and spirituality and how important it is that we address this issue. And I think, Rodney, you brought up the Second Amendment. How do we have that conversation with people who are hardliners, who say, I have a Second Amendment right to bear arms, from a spiritual perspective? And I just give you a little heads up to my thinking. I oftentimes think that we don't need to have a political argument with them, but we need to talk about faith and scripture, and ask them, are you a person of faith, and how that informs us? What's your thinking about, for those who are listening? How do we have a conversation with someone whose mind is made up that the Second Amendment gives them a right to bear arms, and they're not open to any interpretation? Rodney, if you would start us off first, and then Tracy, and then Deanna.
Well, thank you for that question, Jimmy. I think there's a lot that we can do. One of the fundamental things I say when I think about the Bible, I think it gives us a trajectory that talks about the way that we're supposed to relate to human beings. It gives us two basic trajectories about the way that we are to care for other human beings. The first one is found in that Genesis 1 passage and manifests itself throughout the Bible, Genesis 18, Judges 19, Matthew 25, 1 John chapter 4, that we're created in the image of God, that the way that we treat other people is the way that we treat God. Matthew 25 says, whatever you've done to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you've done to me, i.e. God is manifest in this. 1 John chapter 4 says, how can you say that you love your brother or sister, that you love God whom you have not seen, if you don't love your brother and sister whom you have seen, i.e. the way that we treat human beings is the way that we would treat God if God were in our midst. I think that's one of the fundamental trajectories. The other fundamental trajectory is found in passages like Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18b, love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is the basis of what Jesus calls the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, and manifest itself even out into, 1 John, the Gospel of John. Greater love has no man than that he lay down his life for his brother, man or woman, they lay down his life for their brother or sister. In essence, the way that we think about ourselves should be the way that we think about our relationship to others. So we treat others the way that we would treat God, or we treat others the way that we would treat ourselves. And if we can think about these as a basis for our collective understanding, and tell people that this is the heart of the faith, this is the fundamental Gisean ethic. Jesus says this is the way that we are to live with each other, live and engage with each other in the larger community. Then come back to something like the Second Amendment. And the Second Amendment, I think, is fundamentally problematic. In our context, we've lifted it up and tried to place it on the level of Scripture. We've tried to say that this is something that's God-given. It's not. The Constitution and the amendments are both synthetic and plastic. By synthetic, I mean that they're created by human beings. They're created by human beings who knew that they were flawed, knew that they were failing, knew that they were fractured. And because they knew that, they decided to make them plastic, to make them able to be changed, able to be modified. That's what amendments are. Amendments say we didn't get it fully right the first time. Let's try to go back and do it again. Let's edit it. Let's come back and make these shifts to it. If we recognize that the Constitution is a synthetic plastic document in need of change, then we need to recognize that the statements made in it already aren't supposed to be perpetually significant. So, for example, when we think about the Second Amendment, which was created in 1791, when America had 3.9 million people, does that make sense to say that the same rule that made sense back then fits for 2023 when we've got 330 plus million people? It was made when people had guns that could fire maybe 1 or 2 rounds a minute, not when you have guns that could fire hundreds of rounds in a minute. The laws were made by people who also talked about manifest destiny and the elimination of the American Indian population by genocide, that also supported things like, slavery and the abuse of human beings, and that was made legal. These people had bad ideas. We've recognized some of these other bad ideas. Why don't we recognize that this might also be one of these bad ideas? So the Second Amendment is something that needs to be critiqued. And when placed against the Bible, placed against the trajectories that support our love and concern for our sisters and brothers, we can see that it is quite opposed to these ideas, quite antithetical to them. If we're Christians, then we need to figure out where it is that we place our flag. We place our flag with Christ. We place our flag with love. We place our flag with the support of and sustenance of lives of other human beings.
I don't know how I come behind that. That was great. So let me say, I am not a Bible scholar, but what I can say is one of the things that I think that we do is that we have these hard conversations. They're tough conversations. We stop making it taboo to talk about guns, to stop having it be taboo to talk about gun violence. A lot of that, when I think about the faith community, comes from the head. So some of these conversations need to be led by the leaders of the church. So coming from the pulpit, those are conversations that have to have. You have to have one-on-one conversations with your neighbor, one-on-one conversations with people in your family. Let's be very clear that some of us have family members that have views that are different from what we might believe or think to be right. And they certainly believe that their views are right as well. And so having those tough conversations, making this not a taboo thing, and then leading with heart, leading with humanity, because what people can recognize and resonate with is human life. Thinking about a child losing their life because someone failed to secure a gun. Thinking about someone who is suffering through a mental health challenge, getting access to a gun and committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide. Those are things that resonate with everyone. We have to stop thinking about a lot of the work that we do, particularly in my office or offices like mine across the country, is that we put up these maps. We had a map earlier. It's very important to remember that every dot on that map represents an individual that was loved by a family, by a community, and they had a life to live. And so humanizing those dots and humanizing this conversation, making sure that people are connecting to the heart of who they are. No one wants to see their child walk out the door and not come back. That resonates with everyone. So one of the things that we've been doing here in Mecklenburg County is recently launched a new awareness campaign that looks at just that. The campaign really focuses on violence free begins with me, that everyone has a role to play when it comes to violence, and there's something that you can do, but we really have honed in on not another. And so across Mecklenburg County, you'll see these messages with not another missed birthday. Not another RIP, not another thoughts and prayers, because we're tired of saying that every time something happens. We offer thoughts and prayers and nothing more until the next time we have to offer thoughts and prayers. And not another missed birthday, not another accidental death. And so the one that typically resonates with a lot of people is this accidental death. And there's an image of a young Black boy that seems to be a toddler age, and that resonates with everyone. There's nothing cuter than a toddler child. And to think that that child will not grow up because someone failed to secure a weapon, it is something that we have to address. So again, humanizing, having those tough conversations, even with the one-on-one conversations, even with your family members who you know have guns and that may or may not secure those guns. Think about whether or not your child is going to go to someone in your family's home where a gun may not be secured. So I think that's where you kind of level the playing field with folks who are opposed to this topic.
Yeah, so one of the things that we believe is to tell the truth. And so one of the things that we need to do is, first of all, tell the truth about the Second Amendment, and that the Second Amendment historically is there to uphold the institution of slavery and to allow the genocide of the Native people. And so we need to name that. We need to, unmask the powers as to what this Second Amendment was really about, and to be able to say, is that what we want to continue to do? Because Virginia would not ratify the Constitution without it. The Second Amendment, Carol Anderson has a great book on this called The Second, that in which she looks at how she says it was basically a bribe to the southern states to be able to join with the rest of the nation, because they knew that this new nation was going to have the power to undo slavery should it so decide to do so. And so the Second Amendment, it says to uphold for a free state. It was malicious for states to be able to have their slave patrols in order to uphold the institution of slavery. So it wasn't until 2008 that the Constitution became reinterpreted as an individual right. And part of leading up to that, again, we want to reveal the truth that was reinterpreted based upon intentional organizing on the part of the gun lobby. And so Jessica Dawson, she is a professor with West Point, and she did a study in which she looks at the usage of God language in the American Rifleman, which is the magazine of the NRA. And what she discovered is that, for example, just looking at God-given, which is normally, what we hear that gun rights advocates are saying, this is their God-given right. That language didn't even appear in the American lexicon until in the 90s, and really took off steam in the 2000s. So before that, the only time it was mentioned, first of all, was in association with like shooting ability, like raw talent. It was a God-given right, but to have it associated with a government in any form didn't begin to happen until, like I said, the late 90s into the 2000s, but it really took off in 2002. And then that's what led to this reinterpretation of the Constitution in 2008 that says it's now viewed as an individual right as opposed to a collective right. So I think it's important that we name that we're able to see that this is new interpretations. So, we also have to deal with that. And what does that mean? And so that's when we can begin to have conversations about faith, to be able to say, well, this is our understanding and this is what it means to follow Jesus. I think ultimately what it comes down to is people don't really like who Jesus is. Jesus died on a cross. That is not a popular message, right? And so ultimately, I think it's about really learning how to notice that we're in our survival strategies, because this is about safety for a lot of people, right? Like, how can I feel safe? And so we need to really focus on how it is, that we need to honor what people are feeling and figure out how it is. What are you missing? How can we support you? How is it that we can get you to feel safe? And then also be able to look at, have you really thought about, I know you're being told that when you don't feel safe that you need a gun, but what's going to happen when you use that gun? Are you prepared to use that gun? Do you know what it's like? And that's what my father, who's a lifelong hunter, says. He knows you've got to be ready to pull that trigger, and he doesn't have that ability as a hunter. He said, I've taken life, and says that he knows he can't do it. You can't hesitate. So we need to be talking about that side of the conversation instead of always like, I need a gun for safety. Okay, so what's going to happen when you use that? How is it that you're going to use that? And are you aware that what happens whenever you have a gun in your home, that actually your chances of being harmed by that gun increases? The people in your home are no longer safe. That this idea that self-defense is actually a myth created by the gun industry in order to sell guns, because what we know is when there are more guns, there are more gun violence, and when there is more gun violence, there is more guns. And so nothing sells guns like gun violence. And that's where the biggest intake that happened in gun manufacturing was after Sandy Hook, because that's the other truth, is that killing kindergartners, it's really good for business if you're in the gun business. And so we need to name that and recognize that, and to be able to say, where are you hearing this? Does this sell guns, or does this really keep you safe?
Excellent. I really appreciate all of the feedback. We've got about 14 minutes left. I do want to ask one more question that I think is very relevant, and then we will turn to the chat. And so I will say to those of you who are watching, I've seen just one question, but if you have any questions directly to the panelists, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And also, I want to say, and I'm throwing you another curveball to the panelists. I just want you to know, Aria Sadler, who is one of our fellows for OPW this summer, she and I had a conversation at the beginning of the summer talking about her schedule, her focus, what she wanted to work on. And one of the primary issues was gun violence. So out of that conversation, decided to have this webinar, and it's really her dream child. And so I brought that up to say that gun violence is a vital issue to young adults in the life of this country. We see that the March for Our Lives is phenomenal, what these young adults have been able to do. So how do we as a church communicate with young adults who oftentimes don't think about the religious community when they think about advocacy, when they think about the reduction of gun violence? So how do we convince them, one, that we are an ally? What are some of the things that you think you would like to suggest to us? And what are some things you've seen that work? And Deanna, if you will start us out, and then Tracy and Rod.
You know what? I'm going to ask somebody else, because I was reading the chat and I did not hear. Sorry.
Oh,
I don't have the ability. You know what? I'm of that generation to where I cannot multitask. So I cannot read the chat and listen. So Jimmy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem at all. So we'll start with Tracy, Rodney, and then Deanna. And then Deanna, talking about young adults. How can we connect with young adults and things that we can do to be an ally to them?
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. I think that one, again, we have to get outside of the four walls of our church. So many times that some of the youth that we might be thinking about might be attending our church. Those may not be the youth that are at highest risk. Those may not be the youth that are coming from communities that are plagued with violence. And so it's important for us to think about not just the youth that we see every day that are coming as parishioners into our churches, but the youth that we are not reaching. And so there are a lot of those youth, and how do we get to those? I think it is engaging the youth that you do have access to, and getting them, helping them, supporting them to lead efforts. We're never going to get to them. We're just not. I have a 23-year-old, and we're, sometimes we don't agree. We don't see eye to eye. We come from different schools of thought. We're raised differently. And so we're not going to necessarily resonate with what their needs are. We need to empower youth to do the work. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for us to guide them, to provide them with the resources and the skills that they may or may not have to reach their peers. And so it's not really for us to do, it is for us to engage with the youth, for them to do the work. And not to forget that we say young adults, but let's not forget that we have young children, that are elementary school kids, our middle school babies. Those are kids that still have something to say. So finding opportunities to engage with those younger children is also important. And I think a lot of times we miss that. Those are two categories for youth, I'll say, or young people, is we miss this 18 to 24-year-old range groups, and we forget about our young kids who are experiencing violence, that see it every day, that are having to do drills at their school, that they're impacted by violence that they see in their communities, at schools. We're talking about gun violence, but it starts a lot of times with arguments and helping people to diffuse situations that result into end in gun violence. And our young people are seeing that every day. If you ask them how many fights they see at school, you would be surprised. If you've never asked a young person about fights at school, ask them. I think you may be shocked at sometimes how many times they say that there have been fights at their school. I've heard kids tell me that was countless, too many to name. Those are the same things that transpire into when they have access to a gun and they don't know how to diffuse the situation. What do they do? So those are things that we can help with that as houses of faith.
Thank you for that. And I think I want to follow up on that. I think that I just hear the echoes of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham City Jail, that the church was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the younger generation, that it was becoming a social institution that was silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. How do we begin to break out of that mold? How do we begin to remind our young people that we are relevant? In part, we do that by standing up and actually saying something instead of being silent, instead of congregations being led by pastors that sit there and say, I don't want to say anything about this issue because I've got people on both sides and I want to stay neutral. No, as Wiesel says, neutrality always supports the oppressor and never the oppressed. It always helps the dominant class, the status quo, and not those that see that system change. We need to begin to be bold and to step out and say, we as the faith community need to set a different example. And we need to set an example by actually engaging in this work and doing things that show people. And we need to bring young people with us, working beside, being led with younger people as well as we do this work. Young people can help lead us. They're part of our community, and we should lean on them to lead us. I'm so pleased to see my daughter helping to lead this conversation today. We need to listen to the voices of young people in this regard. And then again, I think Tracy pointed it out quite clearly. The people that we need to talk to are often people that won't cross the thresholds of our churches. How do we make sure that we get outside the doors of our congregations? How do we make sure that we are engaging with people in the community and that we as the church remember our mission responsibility to go out to where the people are and not expect people to have to come to us all the time.
Amen. I'll give that an amen. And just to continue to lift that up, one of the things there's a church that invited me to preach one time, and they will remain nameless, but I asked them, I was like, do you want me to do Pulpit Supply? Because it sounded like a Pulpit Supply, or are you asking me to preach on gun violence? And he came back to me and said, oh, we just want Pulpit Supply, because you know what, we got a couple of hunters in this congregation, and we don't want to upset them. And so what I've said, well, I showed up, and guess who came up to me? All the women, all the children, all the youth, and they were all like, boy, we sure wish you would talk about gun violence. We sure wish. So we have to start asking, whose comfort are we centering in our churches? And because here's the thing, our youth know, and they understand what we profess to believe as followers of Jesus. It's not a mystery, right? We say things like love your neighbor, love your enemies. They understand that Jesus died and suffered on a cross because he was so committed to a world of nonviolence. But they don't see that embodied in the church. So the best way to be able to connect with the church is to be able to be the church, right? We need to be able to step into and take action. We need to have them, just as my friend Reverend Sandler said, they need to see us doing this. Because that's what's happening, is they're going, you don't care about what my problem is. You're going to center this gun owner, and you're not going to hear what it's like for me to go to school every day, how afraid I am, the drills that I have to go through. So that's what the youth are receiving. When you don't talk about gun violence and when you aren't taking action, they're hearing that you don't care about the problems that are impacting their lives. And so I think that's the most important thing we can do, is we have to be active in gun violence. And I also don't think, sometimes we hear this, oh, we need the youth to save us, or it's, we're too old to do this. Well, who needs to be doing this more than anybody? the people who are older, you have the capacity to do this in ways that you don't realize, because you are able to take risks that other folks may not be able to take. Younger folks, like whenever the Barman Declaration, whenever we were looking at that within our context, and I was teaching at a church, and it calls for civil disobedience in that confession. And the group was like, are you saying, you want us to go to jail? And I said, if that's what it takes. But let me tell you something, I got to be at carpool. You don't. So if there's anybody who can show up and put their, take some risk, I think it is that, these churches were filled with older members. Well, let's use this. Let's use this to our advantage and put our bodies and our efforts into something that is actually going to create the world that our children deserve to live in.
Excellent. I really appreciate the response. Apologies to the Q&A. We are running short, and so I do want to give our panelists just a minute or two before closing statement, but I will look at some of these very quickly through the chat and see if we can answer some of these very quickly. One was from a pastor who says that got some pushback from a member about petitions. Are they really effective? And I'm going to go ahead and answer that one since that's in my bandwidth. Everything helps. Everything helps, especially if you can let the member of Congress know that you represent constituents. But it's just a piece of the, I don't say no to anything, letters, emails to your members of Congress, petitions, but make sure, again, tie in constituency. Deanna, there was a question for you asking you to put the name of the book that pertaining to the Second Amendment there. And so a couple of people have been asking you about what presbytery you're in. Would like to acknowledge that. And also someone has asked about stories about gun violence and homicides that they're an indictment on adults in our community. And someone else, to tie it in with that, talked about the role that young white males play in the mass shootings in this country. So in Rochester, New York, a multiracial coalition, Generational Engagement Matters, is sponsoring an anti-gun violence essay contest. So I'm going to ask for you to share other stories together. I think I'm going to have to go ahead and move to your closing statements because Aria is going to close us out with a few announcements. So if you could take just a minute or two, and we'll start the way we began. Tracy and Deanna and Rodney, I'm always keeping you to bring up the rear.
Absolutely. That's a good way to bring up the rear. I'll say my closing statements are doing something is better than doing nothing. And so I'm going to move and charge everyone to action. Do something. It is implicit when we do nothing. It means that we don't care. That is exactly what we're saying. We cannot afford to straddle the fence, to stay neutral. Being neutral, no one ever caused any change by being neutral. And so I think that the church has a place to be bold, to make a statement. And if people don't like the statement that you're making as the church, then they'll find somewhere else to go and worship. But you have to take a stance because people are dying. These are people's lives. And the fact that we don't say anything and we won't do anything, again, makes us implicit in everything that we're doing. So again, that was my call to action, is to take action, do something, find some way as an individual, as a community, as a house of faith to move forward.
Thank you. I just want to say, I echo that, do something, take action. And I just want to lift up one more time our Guns to Gardens program that we have, and that we have found is that this is such a good way, again, to take action in that, again, I'm in Texas. And so legislative stuff can be a beating. And this is one concrete, tangible way that I know I'm saving lives, because the people at their last round of Gun to Gardens events, we had folks that brought guns, that they got them out of their home because they knew it was a suicide risk, right? We have people that bring their guns because they can't safely keep them stored, and they're just stored under their couch. And so one of the things that we've discovered, this really is a way to bring gun owners and gun safety advocates together, and to be able to work towards something positive in a way that we all can agree on, is that, if you have a gun that you cannot keep safely stored, Let's dismantle it. And so this is a great way to really bring all these people in your community together in order to do something positive and show that you are making a difference, something you can embody and tangible. And that becomes the fuel for more action. When you're able to have something that can give you the sense of yes, then you become more empowered and you're able to move forward. And so like I said, the thing that surprised me the most with the first event that I went to, which was this one here in Boulder that I've got the t-shirt on for, and then I went to one in Denver at Bronco Stadium, how grateful the people are who show up. They want this. People want this. So we often get all upset about who's going to be the opposition, and what we miss, y'all, is that over 80% of us want gun safety laws, right? So we need to live into that and give some way that we can empower these folks.
Amen. And thank you all. I'm just going to echo what Tracy said by echoing what Deanna said. I'll just say ditto. We need to act. We need to find ways to act, get outside of the box, think outside the box, reimagine this. I was looking at the chat a little bit earlier. One of my brothers, Greg Busby, mentioned John P. Key's effort to do gun buyback programs within communities. I've seen conversations about, I love this notion of guns to gardens, which sounds like beating your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks, turning weapons of destruction into weapons of agriculture to build. I love this notion of thinking in new ways. So, for example, instead of thinking about getting rid of guns, what if we said we outlaw the use of guns against human beings? We said that if self-defense needs to be undertaken with non-lethal weapons, and make this a law. What if we think about an alternative that gives us a positive way to protect our lives, protect individuals, that doesn't include the taking of human lives? I think we need to really be the source as people of faith of new ideas that get us outside the box, that place us in issues in areas where the controversy isn't so great. So let's be creative, and let's stop as the church being both the complicit church, part of this larger problem, or worse, the complacent church, the church that literally does nothing as the world goes to hell in a handbasket.
Amen. Amen. And so again, as we turn to Aria, I do want to thank also Christina Cosby, who is our new domestic representative for the Office of Public Witness. And very quickly, there was a mention in the chat about where the video will be available. If you would make mention of that. And also about resources. The Presbyterian Church has a gun violence resources page that you can access, and also our public policy position statements that are online, and one of them is in particular gospel values, gun violence. So I turn it over to our sponsors today to close us out.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Before we close out, I would like to have a moment of silence for victims of gun violence. Christina, if you could pull up the slideshow, thank you. And if you could just take some time to quietly reflect and think about those who've lost their lives to gun violence. And as we join back together, I also want to say that the image you just saw was of a t-shirt memorial for victims of gun violence put together by Heeding God's Call to End Gun Violence. So thank you to Brian Miller for sharing that image with us. Here now we have resources on our gun violence policy in the QR codes here, and Christina has also posted them in the chat. And I also want to thank everyone who is here with us today for sharing their own resources. As our panelists have talked about, this is a collaborative effort. So really working together and sharing what we know is how we're going to see change. And with that, I want to thank everyone for being here and wish you all a great day. And just thank you for joining us. This has been a huge effort, and I'm glad it's all come together.
Thank you so much, Aria. We also would like to invite everyone, especially our younger participants joining us, to our Young Adult Advocacy Days in Louisville, Kentucky, which will be held on October 20th to 22nd. And so that will be a time for us to gather as a denomination of young adults to see how we can raise our voices and advocate together. And thank you for being here. The recording will be available along with the resources in the follow-up email that you will receive from Zoom, the same place you registered. And there will be an article by the Presbyterian News Service, and we'll make sure the link gets in that article. And we give thanks to our colleagues in communication for covering today's event and all the people that work behind the scenes. Thank you for being here and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. And thank you, Jimmy, for moderating, and to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and wisdom.